Bonjour à tous et toutes. J'ai l'honneur de vous présenter notre modérateur pour cette session, Mokhtar Trifi, vice-président de l'OMCT et ancien président de la Ligue tunisienne des droits de l'homme, organisation lauréate du prix Nobel de la paix dans l'année 2015. Mokhtar?
Oui, bonjour tout le monde. Je suis vraiment ravi de pouvoir vous voir toutes et tous, de modérer cette session. Tout d'abord, je voudrais remercier tous ceux qui ont participé à cette semaine contre la torture dans le monde.
Global Week Against Torture. And I would also like, at the very start, thank the whole team of the OMCT. I would like to thank all those people who around Gerald have organized everything for this week and who managed to do a very good job in spite of all the difficulties that Gerald encountered. So they were able to continue and they were able to do a very good job. So I would like to thank you once again. I would also like to say that the example that we've given this week is something that should be repeated afterwards, because from the very beginning, we realized that there were some problems. We had 638 people who registered through the platform. Hundreds of them participated to the different sessions. There were 17 sessions, different network sessions for full-mindedness 2, and also a theater event, and also some parallel events. So I would like to thank you all, thank all the people who participated to these events, and I would like, on the behalf of the EXCO of the OMCT, I would like to congratulate all those who participated, and once again, our team. So the debates were very important. You most probably followed some of those. On several topics, we've been able to present a very wide landscape of torture about the situation in different situations, the situation of the fight against torture in the different regions, the question of impunity, the new ideas that emerged, and these new ideas have been submitted to the different participants. And you know that all those debates have been recorded and you can listen to those through the platform. And in the future, those debates will serve to feed our work. Now, as Miguel said earlier, we have interpretation in French, English, and in Spanish. So you have at the bottom of your screen the globe with the icon interpretation, and you can click on this to have the language you want to follow. You can send your questions to panelists via the Q&A tab. Also at the bottom of the screen, those questions will be examined by the team and they will be afterwards addressed to the different panelists. And so the panelists will try to answer. This session will be recorded and it will be shared on the social medias of the OMC team. Without much more ado, we are now going to start with a video that's been recorded by our president, Mrs. Ina Gilani, who cannot be with us today, but she is following us. So Mrs. Ina Gilani is advocate at the Supreme Court of Pakistan. She is the member of the Elders, an organization that was created by Nelson Mandela in 2007, where you can find different leaders, advocates of courts dealing with human rights. And she's also present at the level of the Secretariat of the United Nations to deal with human rights. And unfortunately, she could not join us today, but she sent us this video. So I'll ask the organizers to launch the video.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great privilege to be addressing you all at this time. I regret that I wasn't able to participate in any of the events on the Global Anti-Torture Week that you have been attending. Anyway, I didn't want to miss an opportunity to address the OMCT's SOS Torture Network worldwide. So I'm here with you to say how welcome this whole week has been in terms of taking forward our message on eliminating torture. and in energizing and motivating our networks across the world. I think that most of you would have learned a lot about what is happening in every part of the world and what your colleagues are doing in terms of the work and fulfilling the objectives of OMCT. But also, I think we need to keep our mind on how OMCT is also going forward in terms of making new strategies, developing them, and refining them. We are having our General Assembly on the 26th, and we are hoping to put forward certain strategies on some of the core issues that OMCT wants to take up. Namely, I think the most important one, of course, is to make sure that our voices are heard worldwide. And in that context, we feel that promotion and protection of the multilateral system has become even more essential now and critical in a global environment where certain regimes have been undermining this process and for the multilateral forums in an attempt to isolate their own countries, and so that voices are not heard globally on what is happening inside those countries. Secondly, I think the most important thing in my mind is to protect human rights defenders. And I do believe that spaces shrinking for civil society all over the world are making it more and more difficult for human rights defenders to do their work with facility and with no risks involved. And this, I think, is an important area that OMCT must tackle. We must also increase our efforts to protect the more vulnerable, children, indigenous communities, those who are marginalized. Women in particular have a strong contribution to make and a strong role to play. We must facilitate that role that they want to play and are playing. So these are some of the things I think are important. We are going to push against impunity with much more force than we have been doing, and are going to collaborate with our partners around the world and those organizations and individuals who are working against impunity for torture. So these are some of the things I think I would like you to keep in mind. But what we depend on our networks for most is the fact that we need public support, and it's your efforts, the efforts of our networks, that can get us that public support to make our voices stronger in the international community and at the national and local levels. So thank you very much for being there during this process, and I'm sure that you are leaving with as much inspiration as I have had in watching some of the events remotely from Pakistan. Thank you very much.
Donc, désolé.
So the microphone was off. So I'm very sorry. I will, of course, forward your thanks, Mrs. President, to our President, Mrs. Ina Khilani. I'm now going to give the floor to Mrs. Stephanie Power. But first of all, I would like to invite you to use your first name and not your family name. So I apologize if I'm saying Stephanie, if I'm not if I'm not using your full name. So Stephanie, she is a candidate to the EXCO of the OMCT. We'll have the elections tomorrow, and you will be very much applauded as a new member of the EXCO. You're director for Mexico and migrant rights at the Washington Office on Latin America, member of the board of the Centro Prod, member organization of OMCT SOS Torture Network in Mexico, and she's going to introduce us the different friends who members of the EXCO, but I would like also to say hello to our member who stopped her activities as member of the EXCO. And he decided to leave us more than a year ago. So I'd like to say hi to him, as well as the friends that Stephanie is going to introduce to us just now. Stephanie, you have the floor.
Thank you. I have the honor of introducing a really marvelous panel of 4 outgoing EXCO members to look back and reflect on their experience in the fight against torture, and also to look forward at what is coming. So first, we are joined by Jael Quiroga, founder and director of Corporación Reiniciar in Colombia. Second, we are joined by Aminata Die from Senegal, a human rights activist and education specialist at Amnesty Senegal, member of the NGO African Assembly for the Defense of Human Rights. Third, we're joined by Henry Tifan from India, founder and executive director of People's Watch, lawyer in the Madurai High Court, and recipient, among others, of the 2016 Amnesty International Human Rights Award. And finally, by Yves Berthelot of France, former OMCT president, former Under-Secretary General of the United Nations, and Knight of the Legion of Honor of the French Republic. We're also joined by someone else who's going to be helping us in this panel, Zulma Patarroyo, who is a talented graphic designer from Colombia with a wealth of experience bringing live art to international events such as this one. So we're pleased to have her with us today, and you'll be able to see her working through your screens. So we're going to kick off the discussion by looking back over the years, and we want to hear from all of our panelists at least twice. So we're going to ask you in each question to keep your responses to about 2 to 3 minutes so that we can circle around and hear from everyone. And we want to start with a question for Yves, which is, looking back over the years, why does the fight against torture continue to matter, or matter more than ever today?
Well, I think that the fight against torture was at all times important, but it is even more so today. It was always important because torture is destructing societies. It makes people who tolerate it guilty, as well as those who do not want to know about torture. They're also guilty. It also makes the perpetrators bad people. It leaves psychological and physical traces at the level of the victims. And I would like to mention concerning this that the exhibition that was organized by Tunisia presenting 30 faces of victims of torture who were expressing what they felt as victims is a very big event. And it is impressive because they do not talk about pain or about physical consequences, but they were suffering about the doubts that were existing in their countries at the level of their institutions, the suffering they had because they could not look after their families, and also about the disappearance of social relationships, and also the destruction of social connections, more generally speaking. And today, I think that it is even more important to fight against torture because it is more and more tolerated, and it exists more and more in the world. We have observed that authoritarian regimes are more and more present and stronger, and because of these authoritarian regimes, as well as because of other regimes, everywhere we can say that fear is present, and governments are stricter with political measures to give an answer to those fears, because that's how they think they're going to solve the concerns of the population. There is, of course, the fear of the pandemics, but particularly the fear because of economic, political, and military tensions that are present everywhere in the world, that are growing everywhere in the world. And in that context, trend is to silence human rights defenders, and they become victims because of bureaucracy, because of financial conditions. They are also harassed in the judiciary. They are detained, they are tortured, there are some forced disappearances even. And society is not feeling reassured. They don't know what happens as far as torture is concerned. And because of this lack of knowledge, society becomes an accomplice. So that is the reason why in the past years and in the coming years, this SOS Torture Network is more useful and more important than ever. And its strength is in fact coming from the fact that we are present at grassroots level in the countries. We can remind the governments about their commitments. We can go to police stations and be present in the courts. So there is really a need for us to reject torture. And I think that the SOS Torture Network acted remarkably, and I know that it will go on doing so in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that answer. And we also wanted to ask specifically, the fight against torture includes not just the fight against the contemporary ongoing practices of torture, but also the search for justice for torture and other serious human rights violations committed in the past. So a question for Jael in particular, why does that struggle for justice for crimes committed in the past continue to matter?
Gracias. Buenos días a todos y a todas.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everybody. The fight for the truth and justice regarding human rights violations of the past is something that we have to carry on in order to ensure that we have a future with no such violations. And for this, we need to shed light on the structures that gave way to the violations, and also we have to identify the authors in legal terms and also in ethical terms, because impunity gives way to further violations of human rights, and also other possible violators think that their wrongdoings wouldn't have any consequence. And knowing the truth is an essential right of victims, their relatives, and society at large that wants to know what happened. This is a part of the collective memory. And in my country, with a very high degree of impunity, this is very, very essential. It is essential to make a contribution to settle solid foundations for a long-lasting peace. The peace agreement has to establish and offer mechanisms to solve the events that had to do with the armed struggle. And for us, this is very important. It is a contribution to the justice against violations of human rights. And we also have to take into account those that went in exile. The OMCT in Geneva has offered them support, and this is all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, before we ask you some questions to look towards the future, we also wanted to ask each one of you to share quickly an anecdote or a particularly cherished memory from these years of work with the OMCT and the SOS Torture Network. So let's go around to each of you. Perhaps we can start with Aminata and then Henry, because we haven't heard from them yet. And then we can hear from Yves and from Jael. If each of you can share quickly one cherished memory or one anecdote of what it has been like to work with the OMCT network over these years.
Merci beaucoup. C'est très difficile cette
Thank
question.
you. Now, this is a difficult question because there are lots of anecdotes and there are lots of nice things. There were lots of challenges as well, but there were lots of successes. I wanted to share our work on detention centers. In fact, in South and North Kivu in 2014-2015, we really worked on detention centers. It was something really difficult, but it also gives us lots of hope because there are people who are there to show what is hidden, and this is the role of OMCT. We were in a prison of Calais, and when we visited this prison, we found an 80-year-old woman who was in prison. I also found 2 children who were imprisoned with militaries. If we weren't on the field, then these people wouldn't be freed. It's something which is hidden. It's the problem is that there are some people who think they have the power to imprison others. When we were there, we asked them, why is this old woman there? Why are these children there? And they said, well, someone brought them there. And these children didn't understand anything. They didn't understand how they ended up there. And if we weren't there, and if we didn't call the prosecutor, then these children wouldn't have been freed. And the problem was that there was a dispute with the parents. That's why they were there. Now, if we don't do field work, if we're not there, then lots of people will lose hope. You know, it's kind of like when we're in a room with more than 80 people. In South Kivu, there were prisoners which were over each other, you know, and so some of them were over each other. There were more than 80 people in a room. It was dark. I think I only used my phone torch to see, and we asked them, why are you over each other? Well, they said it's because if we're all on the ground, we can't breathe. So we try to have a bit more air. And this really affected me. Because once again, if we didn't go to that detention center, we would have never seen this issue. And, you know, I even stepped on a person because there were so many people. But as I said, there were other people who went on top of each other to be able to breathe from the top. And yeah, this was something that really affected me. Now, there are other things that I can't talk about, but this is what I'm saying. It's sometimes difficult. There are challenges, but we have to face these challenges together. We have to accept that there are some situations which are better than others. And when I told OMCT, well, some of these people don't even have anything to eat. And the Minister of Justice said, well, this prison is just out of standards. And I knew this person because she worked on civil society for civil society before, and she was a minister now. I said, you know, it's difficult. The position that you had in civil society should have made you do something. And so I said that it was shocking for this minister to say that this prison was just downgraded and that she couldn't do anything about it. I think it's important to share. And I think tomorrow we will see that we will have new members who will be able to continue our work, people who will continue to give hope to people who are tortured, who are arrested, and who don't have a voice. We need to help these people who have no one, who don't have the means to have something to eat. This is what is good about OMCT, and this is what is powerful of this network. this is what I wanted to share with you. And I wanted to thank you. I've been here since 1994, not as a member, but I was there as a member of an organization, and we were able to really move forward a long way. And I was really grateful to participate during these meetings, but I hope that they will not be the last ones. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. Henry, do you want to share with us a memory, an anecdote quickly?
Good evening, good afternoon, wherever we are. Tough question, as Aminata said. I would therefore start with a story when I entered OMCT and start with the story when I am leaving the position in OMCT, but not leaving OMCT. In the year 2000, and that was the link between the local work and the international work. When we started realizing that it was important for us to observe the 26th of June for the number of cases of torture that we were handling. And we said, this is the day we should be able to be in solidarity with victims of torture, but not only be in solidarity with victims of torture, ensure that we campaign in this country like India, where the Convention Against Torture had not been ratified. And therefore, we started observing first a day. We continued the next year observing a week, and then we started observing a month. And in India, we do things in style. So we don't do things in small. Our marriages are not as simple as small marriages with small gatherings. Eve understands what I'm saying. We like to do things big. And therefore, the campaign against torture in this whole month was 4 different yatras in vehicles with folk artists moving from village to village, village to village, to ordinary people, and telling them, reminding them of what torture was and how torture was illegal, and how we had to all unite beyond the caste that we are born into, beyond the religions that we owe allegiance to fight this evil of torture. This was in the early 2000s. Moved into in 2005, 6, 7, and 8 into a large national project supported by the European Union, where we had OMCT inspiring us, because we were looking at 47 states in this country, in this large country covering nine states, 47 districts. And on the last month of the project, in December 2008, we had a huge tribunal where cases of torture were heard. But this was not physical. We did not need a COVID to teach us how to escape from the visa regime of India. We had Eve, we had Eric, we had Eric, the then Secretary General, who was sitting in the comfort of the Geneva office of OMCT, but heading a jury of a number of people into a number of cases of torture in India. And that was the link between the local movement against torture and an international organization which is in solidarity with its local partners. Last year, my dear friends, in June 2000, when the height of COVID, not because they did any terrorist act, not because they were alleged to be urban Naxals in India, this was a father and a son who had not supposed to have closed their shop at 8 o'clock, when during the pandemic it had to be so, was the allegation. They were taken to a police station, beaten and tortured in different ways. And 3 days later, the father and the son died in judicial custody in the sub-jail. This became a movement. And this became a movement asking for justice. But this time it was an organized movement. And the little effort that OMCT encouraged me and stood by me in my earlier days, 20 years ago, today we have a joint action against custodial torture, which is the platform in my state of 80 to 90 different organizations with 25 political parties who are members. And we hope in the next few days, one of them would also start ruling the state and make torture, zero tolerance to torture in our state. We have been able to see success, but that starts, the fight against torture starts through a movement of people. It is the movement of people occupying streets, fighting torture that breaks impunity. It is not only the courts, it is also our efforts on the streets which brings public opinion against torture. And that has been the strength I go back when I leave OMCT. OMCT for us is part of our large family. We can leave the executive committee, but we cannot leave our SOS torture. We cannot leave OMCT. We will be pestering. We will be pestering OMCT with a lot of membership, with a number of people who will join, because we are leaving. There will be many others who will join and ensure that this world movement is really a world movement of people fighting against torture.
Thank you. Eve, would you like to add something?
Oui, je voudrais ajouter un témoignage
Yes, I
personnel.
would also like to talk about personal experience.
Ah. J'ai l'anglais. Ah, pardon, j'ai l'anglais en même temps, alors il faut que je l'enlève.
Sorry, I have English at the same time. I just have to remove the English.
Voilà.
There we go. I think that's better. Okay, sorry about that. So I wanted to talk about a personal experience. It's about an old Algerian woman. Her woman disappeared during the dark times in Algeria. I think it was between 1991 and 2002. And her son disappeared around 2000. And she really wanted to have news from her son. And one day she went to the police station, and there was a copy of a requirement done by OMCT to free her child. She knew that her child died, but she wanted to know what happened to him. And this call from OMCT was for her an act of freedom. In fact, she found out that in other places of the world, in Geneva or in other places of the world, people who cared about him, people who thought that he was arrested and that it wasn't fair. And so she found her dignity again. For me, this testimony was really important because this shows the urgent calls that are done by FIDH and OMCT. And sometimes victims can be freed thanks to these calls. Sometimes the conditions of victims can be improved. They have less torture. But I think what we need to underline is that victims and families know these urgent calls, and it is for them hope, and it is a silver lining. Now, I have many other memories to share. I had, for example, the chance to attend the proceeding in Bangladesh of the boss of, oh, what was the name again? Odikar. Odikar, that's right. And during this proceeding, during this trial, I saw different ambassadors from different countries who were just there to attend. They just wanted to say that they were there. And they just wanted to say, well, we're trying to understand what is happening in other countries in legal matters. And well, luckily, he was freed that day. So yeah, this was a really good memory. Now, if I can finish with maybe just another souvenir, another memory, is maybe the last meeting with the Executive Council. I met these people for a number of years, and I know these people, and I really want to thank everyone working for OMCT. I want to really thank all the members of the Executive Council that I have known. And well, what I want to tell you is, well, keep up the good work you're doing. It's necessary. Torture will never stop. And if we don't have this solidarity, there will be no hope. So thank you for this solidarity that you're bringing.
Thank you. Kyle, would you like to share a memory?
Sí. Sí. También quiero hacer remembranza.
Yes, I would like to recall how I arrived at the OMCT. For me, well, it changed my life. I remember in 1992, after a terrorist attack I suffered as a human rights defender, when the secretary of our Human Rights Committee was assassinated, I felt depressed and I felt guilty, but then José Miguel Vivanco from Human Rights Watch came to Arisotas, and the OMCT became aware of these facts immediately, and then they provided us with the resources from the fund for the victims of torture. I think this is an essential fund. And thanks to this fund, I was sent abroad from Colombia, and they paid for my stay in a different Latin American country. For me, that was a way to protect life and the life of my family. From then onwards, the ONCT became my family, and it helped me in my struggle in favor of human rights, against torture and against ill treatment. Here, we had degrading treatment and torture when people suffers an attack, or when we receive threats, and many times when we have to leave the country. So these became a part of the fundamental rights to defend. So that's why I'm really thankful for this fund for the victims of torture. It can save lives. I think that the international community and cooperation agencies should support this OMCT fund because it really serves its purpose. A second program which I think that can be quite powerful, especially in Latin America, since poverty and inequalities in Latin America are rampant. Torture can be seen from a different perspective, that is, the cause and effect relation between torture and human social and economic rights.
La agitó mucho Eritzotas en América Latina.
Eritzotas in Latin America promoted this a lot, and I would like the OMCT to continue these actions in order to tackle the grassroots of torture and degrading and inhuman treatment when the states do not comply with social, economic and human rights. This led to the mobilization of political movements, and of course, social protests was criminalized, which led to the violations of the human rights of demonstrators. In this sense, the OMCT carried out actions as rapporteurs. They participated in alternative country reports in order to show the level of compliance of rights in terms of work, food, land, access, water. So the OMCT was carrying out a really important task and was promoting as fairer and more inclusive economic and social system, as well as a reform of the law enforcement system, decent conditions in prisons, etc. All this helps, but we also need to contribute in the fight for social justice, non-discrimination, which are also ways of torture and inhuman, cruel and degrading treatment. We are obliged to promote a fair system and to tackle the root causes of torture. That's what I remember from the OMCT programs. I would also like to mention the following. The task that Gerald has carried out. He is a noble, generous man, humble, and quite successful in his work. He has worked and he has increased and raised the level of support all over the world to the victims of torture in order to overcome impunity. Under Gerald's direction, the OMCT has helped a lot in this stage where we are trying to end up with impunity resulting from the armed conflict. And due to the peace agreement that was signed, Gerald was following with this closely in Geneva with the special jurisdiction for peace. We received a lot of support from them, and we really would like to thank him. I would also like to point out the work that my colleagues have done at the executive committee level. Yves, he's a great friend, he's a great man, he's a beautiful person, I love him a lot. And this openness that they had is something that is close to my heart. You are my family, Yves, Aminata, Henry. I love you all, and I hope that we can keep on seeing each other in this struggle that united us. So thank you for including me in this struggle. Thank you for trying to prohibit torture and cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment all over the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We are over time, but we wanted to end looking quickly ahead to the future. And you've already looked ahead to the future in your messages, so that's wonderful. But let's just take 2 minutes, maybe a minute each, to ask specifically. Aminata, you spoke of people who were deprived of liberty and in terrible conditions. What is one thing that OMCT Network can do better in the future to protect especially vulnerable populations?
Well, Stephanie, thank you. I started in 1994 with the OMCT, and I would have liked to say a few words about this. It's a pity, but there were many people who really helped me in my work. But when we talk about vulnerable groups, what we have to say that the work is very difficult because we are within a network that is willing to do things, but we have difficulties because it's difficult when you lack resources. And I think that the OMCT had started to work in cooperation with Agir Ensemble in 2014, 2015. And I think that we should strengthen this work. We should continue the monitoring work because it's very important. There are many violations of human rights, not only related to the conditions, the degrading conditions in which those people live, but there are also cases of torture. And I think that it is important in conflict zones where there is hardly any form of authority. So I think that we should go on working on that. I know that it is difficult because these are difficult zones in which to act, but we had started working, and maybe we should further insist on this so that those children and those women can have a voice. Particularly, we have to train them because without any training, it's impossible to ensure that monitoring is going to be made. I know that at the very beginning in 1994, within the framework of the OMCT, there were some training sessions. Even if it's online, it's good, but I think that we should strengthen the training of the organizations. There are many new people coming in, people leaving their organizations. So I think it's very important to ensure the succession. We have to support and train those people so that we can really go on working on the truth concept so that people are protected, because we know then that we are protected. So it's very important to ensure that there is a continuous training, a continuous support to local organizations at grassroots level that do not have the resources to do that kind of work. So they need a lot of assistance through the SOS network. And concerning women, I think it is a cross-cutting topic. We are working on the topic of migration, but I think that is important as well to also deepen the topic of kids and women, because you know that there is a lot of cross-cutting work that should be carried out on the violations, but particularly concerning women through this kind of paths, migration paths are submitted to violence, are subjected to sexual acts and so on and so forth. So I think that these are indeed more vulnerable people, and it should be a cross-cutting topic, the topic of women. We should not work separately on women. We should not have just organizations working on women and then other organizations working on the topic of human rights, because sometimes then the topic of women is hidden in those organizations. So I think that it's very important also to highlight these vulnerable groups and to give them a voice, to give a voice to those organizations representing women and vulnerable groups. Then another point is that we have more and more organizations that have no support, they have no training. So the aspect of money is important. We see what happens in our societies with youth organizations. They are demonstrating, but after that, there's a lot of work to be done because of some violations. So I think it is important to work with reliable organizations, with youth organizations, and we should also be diversified. We should have more women organizations. We should have more youth organizations, not only dealing with the youth, but helping the young people behind those organizations. I think we really need that. And we've done all this fantastic work for the youth, but we should not allow everything to disappear in a way. So that is a call I'm making to the OMCT. And I think there are fantastic people, Yves, Raël, Henry, and all the others, the people who were there before them. So I started in 1994, and until now, I could say that the baby has really grown up and has learned to walk well. So thank you very much. I will be present at all times to support you. Whatever you ask from me, I'll do it, and I'll go on doing it until the very last day of my life. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So one final thought, Henry, you spoke about the importance of public mobilization, civil society work. So what can the OMCT do going forward to better protect human rights defenders and win back some of that closing civil society space?
I need first to acknowledge the fact that after many years, OMCT has rightly placed its attention on India. Many people hesitate to place attention on India, and for obvious reasons. But in a very difficult situation when the country is undergoing, where there is a lot of repression and a lot of democratic space that is getting closed, human rights defenders in prisons on charges and investigations done by a central agency, at this point of time, OMCT has come to take control of reins and invest its solidarity with the defenders community in India. And on behalf of Indian human rights defenders and the most vulnerable sections, I want to place my gratitude to OMCT through its Secretary General, its very committed staff, and the President and the Executive Committee for placing this trust. Many sections, and even today I was in a training program of an OMCT funded, initiated program where I spoke about the roles that we take in terms of human rights defenders. And therefore, I think it is important to know that the sign of hope is not in the things we achieve, but in pursuing relentlessly the fight to fight impunity, even though defenders are in difficult circumstances. Every fight is strengthening human rights defenders in different ways. The nights when I've seen OMCT staff, and I find it embarrassing to name people here, but we, on behalf of a number of human rights defenders, would like to place our gratitude to all those staff who have stood in solidarity and made various mechanisms of the United Nations come closer to us. It is this solidarity that is going to be meaningful to human rights defenders and human rights platforms, and ensuring that the protection measures are there. I personally have a bank account that is closed in the year 2012. And today, if my voice is still strong, I owe it to OMCT. And I think saying more will not be expressing gratitude. And I want to place my gratitude towards them for that. And they will continue to do it. We will continue to be there. And I'm sure they will continue to do the same work. Mobilizing human rights defenders is the only way out. And OMCT has been showing the way in doing it through our SOS torture network as well. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Eve, very especially to you. I remember the promises I made you. I could not keep up the promises, but still, the struggle is on. To all of you in the executive committee, you all have met personally a lot to us. And when I say to us, not personally to us, not personally to our families, but to families and families of defenders for whom OMCT and each one of you serving and walking out of the executive committee have meant as a family. I don't think there is a world organization which feels as a family as OMCT feels. My greatest gratitude to all of you for that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to all of our panelists here for sharing your thoughts. And thank you so much for your work and your contributions as members of the Executive Council. I'll now be handing the floor to Raël, who is going to share a poem with us.
Thank you very much. I think that the OMCT has had an important impact in my country, in Colombia. And I think that the OMCT needs to keep on accompanying human rights defenders at this time. It needs to support the system of justice, not repetition. We are committed with this system as in order to overcome impunity in Colombia, not only in terms of the internal conflict. And it is important for them to support the Colombian Coalition Against Torture with reports by making the situation of human rights defenders and social leaders visible. The situation that we are living in this country is really dreadful. Those who signed the peace treaty, some of them have been killed. Some of them signed this treaty when the conflict was still existing with other organizations. We have a government that attacks the system day after day, and they internally they do not agree on implementing the peace agreement, but externally they say that they are complying with it. The support of the OMCT is going to be positive to contribute to peace and to protect the rights and the life of the human rights defenders. That's why I'm thankful for the work of the OMCT. We will keep on working. We will keep on this fight that has been so important for us. We need to see this fight from all perspectives. No one is exempt from inhuman, cruel, and degrading treatment. I've been told to read a poem of a Spanish poet, José Agustín Goytisolo. He had to find refuge during the Franco era in Spain. He took refuge in France. The poem is called "No One Is Alone." This is one of his best poems, but also one of the saddest poems. It has to do precisely with torture, which is a cruel crime that should be eradicated. This poem, as I said, is called Nadie está solo, no one is alone. And it reads as follows. At this very moment, there is a man who suffers, a man tortured just for loving freedom. I do not know where he lives, what language he speaks, what color his skin is, what is his name. But at this very moment, when your eyes read my little poem, that man exists. He cries out. You can hear his cry of a harassed animal as he bites his lips so as not to denounce his friends. Can you hear him? A man alone cries out handcuffed. He exists somewhere. Did I say alone? Don't you feel like I feel the pain of his body repeatedly in your own body? Doesn't your blood gush under the blind blows? No one is alone. At this very moment, you and I, we have been tied. That's the poem that I wanted to read. It's a sad poem, but it's realistic, by José Agustín Goytisolo. Thank you very much.
Bon, donc Stéphanie, je te remercie énormément.
Okay, Stephanie, I would really like to thank you for facilitating this session. At the end of this panel, I would also thank all those leaving the Executive Council, Aminata, Jael, Henry, and Yves. It was also a pleasure for me to work with you all this time. And I still believe that they're actually not going to leave us. Huh? They have so much experience here at OMCT, and this experience will be useful to us and will be useful for our common cause. Now we will move on to the second part of this panel. I would like to introduce Niels Melzer, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, Degrading Treatments or Punishments. I would also like to introduce Heidi Hautala, Vice President of the European Parliament. So as I said, Niels Melzer is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. He is also the Human Rights Chair of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. He has lots of experience in human rights and humanitarian. He also worked for 12 years for the International Committee of the Red Cross. He is also a senior security policy advisor to the Swiss Federal Department of Foreign Affairs. Niels Melzer, you have the floor. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Vous avez 7 minutes. Nous vous entendons bien et vous avez 7 minutes.
Yes, we can hear you well and you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. I just have to clarify that currently, obviously, I'm not working for the Swiss government. I'm not a security policy advisor. This is my past function. I don't think it would be compatible with my current function. But thank you very much for this introduction and for having me. It is now 70 years, I'd like to remind everybody, that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has proclaimed the first universal prohibition of torture and ill treatment. And since then, an unprecedented consensus has formed as to the absolute and non-derogable and even peremptory nature of this prohibition. And even a sophisticated international normative and institutional framework has been developed to implement it throughout the world. But at the same time, as you know much better than everybody else, torture and ill treatment continue to be practiced with impunity throughout the world, whether in the context of criminal justice, national security, law enforcement, border control, socio-economic discrimination of minorities and vulnerable groups, even domestic violence, which is tolerated in many countries, every year causes more victims than all wars taken together. So this sobering reality really raises the question, I think, as to the credibility of states' commitment to the prohibition of torture and ill treatment on the one hand, but it also raises the troubling question how we can explain the worldwide complacency of the general public with impunity of their own officials for torture. And in order to get a better understanding of this reality we're dealing with, I did two things recently. First, I submitted an in-depth report to the UN General Assembly on the neurobiological and psychosocial factors that are conducive to this complacency and impunity for torture. And the report that I established together with renowned social psychologists shows that the collective behavior and decision-making patterns of state officials, but also the general public, are strongly influenced by unconscious emotional patterns that result in forms of self-deception, frankly. And most notably, as human beings, we all have a scientifically well-documented defensive mechanism which responds to unwelcome truths with various forms of denial of reality. As a result, we live in a virtual world where torture is simultaneously absolutely prohibited and routinely practiced everywhere. And as much as we are tempted to morally condemn this discrepancy between fiction and reality, for the most part, it really is not a moral question. There is obviously a moral issue, but for the most part, it is simply a scientific neurobiological way of functioning. And it's a consequence of what happens if you allow people to exercise power with impunity, with secrecy, without any effective form of oversight and accountability. And to prove the practical relevance of this observation, I did a second thing. I actually conducted a statistical analysis of the effectiveness of states' responses to my communications throughout the past 4 years. So more than 500 communications, 90% of my communications did not receive a fully cooperative, positive response by states. So 9 out of 10, I was not able to resolve the case, to effectively prevent, investigate, or initiate a prosecution or redress of that allegation of torture. Likewise, 8 out of 10 of my country visit requests were not responded to or did not receive a positive response. So as I told the Human Rights Council, the harsh reality is that over the last 4 years, the cooperation of states with my mandate has been marked by a failure rate of 80% on country visit requests and 90% on individual communications. And historically, this has remained the same largely since the mandate has been established 35 years ago. Now, it goes without saying that a failure rate of 90 or 80% over 35 years exposes more than just an occasional failure. It exposes a systemic failure, which fundamentally questions the credibility, as I said, of states' commitment to the prohibition of torture. Now, unfortunately, this also painfully confirms the practical relevance of this kind of self-deceptive patterns and denial of reality, which my report to the General Assembly describes. And in order to reverse these trends, we really need a complete change of attitude among states. And I have urged states to act, but unfortunately, I'm not optimistic that my call alone will be sufficient to bring about the required change. So, as I have said to the panel yesterday on police violence, what we are facing today is nothing less than a crisis of democracy, where the separation of power exists on paper, but does not work in practice when it's really challenged in a serious way. And torture obviously is a real test case on this. How else is it possible that we have an absolute prohibition of torture and simultaneously worldwide complacency and impunity with it? It means that the judiciary and parliaments are not effectively exercising their oversight over governmental power. And the problem is not that, let's say, we the people, ordinary people, want torture to be practiced, but it is that those in power have ceased to be held accountable. So we the people have to reclaim this democratic power and hold our leaders to account. But for this to happen, we need public awareness for what the problem is, and also awareness for our own natural tendencies to avoid uncomfortable truths about our own government through self-deception and denial of reality. And this is precisely where all of you come in. You are the ones who have the information, who have the expertise. You know what is going on throughout the world, and you can wake up the broader public and ask them to hold their governments to account. Now, more than ever, all of you and your work and efforts are needed. We, at the UN, need you. I certainly do. States and their people need you. And by God, the millions of voiceless victims and their families need you. So let us stand tall for the truth and for justice and for human dignity. Let us stand together, for together we are strong. And though many of us have faced pushback and do on a daily basis, even threats and intimidation, let us not forget that our voices are legitimate voices. That is the voices of the people, including the countless people who do not yet know, sometimes don't even want to know, about the crimes that are being committed in their names. The voice of the countless people against whom these crimes are being committed right now as we speak, but also the voice of the countless children and future generations whom we can still protect from becoming victims of torture in the future. It is really up to each and every one of us to stand up and take responsibility. And I feel privileged to be part of your network. Thank you very much.
Merci infiniment, Professor Niels.
Thank you, Professor Niels. You need us, but we also need you. Even despite what you said, 9 out of 10 of your communications don't receive an answer, but and when you receive responses, they are usually negative. But in the UN system, we still think that you're making an extraordinary work. And so we invite you to keep up this good work. And it's a great thing that we continue to collaborate. Thank you very much. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Heidi Hautala. Heidi Hautala is a vice president of the Parliament, European Parliament. She serves in various committees, like the Subcommittee on Human Rights. She also promoted initiatives in favor of human rights, such as the creation of the working group responsible business conduct in the European Parliament. She is also former Minister of International Development and of State Ownership Steering in Finland. You have the floor, madam.
Thank you very much. I'm humbled to speak after the Special Rapporteur Niels Melzer, because I cannot express how much I appreciate this work and this difficult work that you do. So indeed, across the continents, the people who face torture and ill treatment are very often human rights defenders. And I want to thank the OMCT that their case is so often championed to us via your alerts. These are really vital, so that, for instance, the European Parliament can react and take action quickly. Unfortunately, near and far torture remains a key part of the oppressor's range of tools to abuse and terrorize. In December last year, the European Parliament awarded the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought to the pro-democracy activists in Belarus. According to human rights organizations in Belarus, almost 2,000 people have reported that they have been subjected to torture by the police for participating in peaceful protests. While we celebrate the citizens' courage, we try to find ways to help in the fight against impunity. There are also horrible crimes, including torture at the moment in Myanmar against the peaceful people. Yesterday, an International Parliamentarians Alliance for Myanmar was established with the help of the very important network of ASEAN parliamentarians for human rights. So my message to you would be that in this old fight against torture and other severe human rights violations, we may have some new tools and we may need new thinking. And my key message is that we don't need to speak of torture and fighting torture only in arenas reserved for discussions about torture. We can break away from silos. We can look into such policy areas as international trade. We can discuss the connections of international trade to forced labor and torture, and we can make businesses accountable as well as governments. So indeed, we celebrate the 10th anniversary of the United Nations Guiding Principles of Business and Human Rights in June this year, and this is really a milestone. Now, following this, the European Parliament wants to implement these guiding principles of business and human rights, and we want to have an EU-wide law on mandatory human rights due diligence. It would apply to all EU businesses and to those companies who want to trade in the EU. And I can tell you that the law is on its way, and it will leave a mark in the international arena. This kind of a law would be composed of binding EU due diligence rules, which would oblige companies to address aspects of infringing human rights in their value chains. And naturally, torture ranks at the top of the human rights violations. this law seeks to prevent and remedy. Importantly, under the new law, victims are entitled to a remedy. At the moment, access to justice of victims of abuses by corporations is very random and uncertain, but this may be changing. Secondly, I'd like to mention another instrument. Due to the demands of the European Parliament and the civil society, the EU adopted in December 2020 a new EU global human rights sanctions regime. And this new regime applies to serious human rights violations such as genocide and crimes against humanity, as well as to torture and slavery in particular. This regime will enable the EU to respond quickly and effectively to serious human rights violations and abuses worldwide. It will encompass a travel ban and asset freeze in the EU, and the new tool can be used in individual cases of abuse. Now, to our delight, on the 22nd of March, the EU used this tool to impose sanctions on a number of individuals and government bodies deemed responsible for using torture in China. A number of Chinese officials were sanctioned on grounds of serious human rights violations and degrading treatment of the Uyghur people. And we have all seen reports of how, for instance, rape has been used as method of torture against female Uyghur detainees in internment camps in Xinjiang region. Many women disappeared after being taken into the dark rooms. So I believe that setting individual sanctions in this kind of cases is utterly necessary. By the way, China immediately put a number of EU actors on their sanctions list, including the Human Rights Subcommittee of the European Parliament. Now, all too often, in this increasingly interconnected world, torture and ill treatment are linked to forced labor and modern slavery. In October 2020, just to name you one example, our parliament adopted a resolution on the situation of Ethiopian migrants who were kept in detention centers in Saudi Arabia. Most worryingly, those migrant workers who attempted to challenge their detention conditions were reportedly severely tortured by the Saudi security forces. So now the EU is examining how to put in place a legal instrument to prohibit imports of products produced with forced labor. And I think this is really important, and it hopefully becomes law in the near future. I believe that some of these new tools would present us with new opportunities, adding to the old and good ways to fight against torture and other severe human rights violations. The fight against torture and other ill treatment is enshrined with the EU legal and political framework, and EU will no doubt whatsoever continue to oppose any attempt to limit this absolute prohibition. Thank you very much. And thank you for the work you do.
Merci beaucoup, Madame.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hautala. The work that is done and that will continue to be done by the European Parliament really is incredible work. And so I think all the initiatives that you are taking are extremely important, and we really hope that this list grows and that we will be able to fight against torture. Now we will move on to questions. And so members will ask you the questions. Miguel, maybe you want to ask the questions?
So there's a question for Niels from the audience. Basically, there's this idea that the COVID crisis has exacerbated the human rights crisis, whether we speak about freedom of expression, etc. There's an interest in knowing how was your assessment on what has been the impact of the COVID context on the fight against torture? A very broad one, but maybe some quick reflections.
Yes, maybe. Obviously, this is opening a whole new seminar. Unfortunately, it has been for me personally. It has been extremely difficult to address this crisis in a meaningful manner because I'm under lockdown as well. I have travel restrictions. I cannot go and visit prisons And I feel now more than ever, I should actually be out in the field and visit prisons and be able to speak to prisoners and inspect the detention conditions. You know, even and you know better than me, even the traditional sources, indirect sources that we might have from family members that can visit and supply food and, you know, all the medical needs and so on to the inmates, even that has been cut because they don't have access to their family members. And so also the information doesn't come out anymore. So I think that is in many regions a huge problem. And, you know, always when there is no transparency, there is no exchange of information, it's the same effect as a legal black hole, basically, where there is no oversight. And so I think, unfortunately, I'm afraid what we still have to discover, what is really going on behind all those walls that where we have no communication. But what we know, obviously, that in many places of detention, especially, there are huge problems in terms of conditions of detention. You know, they're in no way adequate to social distancing and these types of things. Or in some Western countries, there is now a kind of a systematic, you know, imposing of solitary confinement, which again becomes inhumane very quickly. So I mean, I don't even know where to start to discuss this issue. I would say that this crisis has more serious consequences that we can still fathom right now that are absolutely relevant in terms of torture and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment.
Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mokhtar. And there's also a question from the audience for Ms. Hautala. Basically, there's a lot of appreciation for the role of the European Union through its foreign policy, and very often the delegation does a lot of support for organizations in the field, etc. There's a concern on whether the EU is going to lose some ground on this leadership because of the human rights situation inside the EU borders as well, in issues like migration, rule of law in certain countries, etc. So there's a question on what is being done by the European Union, the European Parliament, to also address the situation inside these borders so that it can remain a powerful actor in its foreign policy as well.
I suppose I can answer now, right? Yes, I think there's no reason to hide this very unpleasant situation that there is this kind of double standard in many situations. And I think migration, asylum are the most painful issues that the EU has not been able to deal with. And I don't think you can only blame the fact that the EU has not been able to agree on a common asylum policy. It's also that there is clearly there's unwillingness to follow and respect fundamental rights and human rights in operations, whether by the member states or the EU. But the European Parliament has been quite vocal and quite tough on Frontex, the border agency, because it has been well documented that the Frontex has committed serious breaches of human rights in its operation. So at least I would say that the Parliament can bring some accountability to this issue. And we have even, I think today or yesterday, we voted on these things. So indeed, I think for the EU to continue to be a vocal and credible defender of human rights, I believe that this kind of this kind of issues must be addressed. I would say there's a bit more hope on these situations where member states clearly leave principles of rule of law behind and start to develop oppressive authoritarian regimes. So we have seen that within its possibilities, the EU has been quite tough on Hungary and Poland. And it remains to be seen what this process is underway will actually lead to. But I am pleased to see that there has not been more talk about the necessity and importance of rule of law. within the EU as we have now. So at least there is this awareness that this is precious, and hopefully all this will be then reflected in concrete actions. So we have to continue to fight this.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much. I think there is no other question to ask you. You have been very complete in your presentations, and most probably will have other opportunities in the future to meet with you. And we are going to continue, therefore, our session with the final conclusions. Normally, Claudia Samayoa should have been with us, but she's sick. So it is Gerald who is going to start a monologue, a conversation with himself. I don't know where he is. I can't see him. So, Gerald, you have the floor. You can please start this conversation that should have taken place with Claudia, but on your own.
Thank you. And I apologize that we had to be a little bit shorter with the question and answers because we're running out of time, as it always is in these type of events. But I think I'm asked to give some thoughts about this week, and it's very difficult. I remember when I received my degree in law school in the US, there were all these dignitaries, and the last one was Roy Lichtenstein, and he went to the stage and he said, well, after all I've heard, everything I would add is hilarious. I feel a little bit in the same situation. Everything to add after what we've heard would be really hilarious. But unfortunately, I'm not Roy Lichtenstein, so I still think I have to say a few words. And the first thing I want to say here is really going back to what we had as a title for the first session, but a bit for the whole week, I think. From darkness to light. From darkness to light, because we are a Geneva organization. It's the slogan of the city and the canton and Republic of Geneva, from darkness to light. But from darkness to light, because it is so much connected to our cause that we work on, to our movement, and the challenges we face. And the first one I wanted to make in this context is about the light. I think you all, the movement out there, the network out there, you have been the light during this week. We had Mokta mentioned some 683 people signed up. We had 17 sessions, 4 cafes, network cafes, sessions on mindfulness, 2 movies, etc. And I think I felt, and this is my takeout really, I felt much stronger as being part of a network and a movement. Normally we would have had maybe 60 or 70 of you here, and a very good time and discussion, enlightening, encouraging. I've seen there's a bigger movement out there, and I think that's part of the future, the way forward. And I've seen that this movement is a light, it is diverse, it is vibrant, it is resourceful, it is activist, and it has enormous expertise. And that's the biggest treasure we have. We had regional sessions and cross-regional sessions. And this, I think, is also what we have to maintain, the learning from each other. The expertise is not with you. The expertise is with all of you. So you are the light. This is my first message. When you go to darkness and light, of course, we also discussed about the centrality of the issue of torture today. And we want to bring that to light. We want to make sure that torture is seen as one of the key issues of today's world and of the societal evils in a way that we see. If you look through the agenda, you have the police brutality as torture, which we've seen in Covet everywhere, which we've seen in public protests everywhere. You've seen detention. You've seen migration and torture. It's about torture. About security, counterterrorism. It's about torture. Everywhere is torture. So it's a central problem, and it's not always seen. But it's also a central solution. And I remember in the opening session how the representative of the Swiss government said, there's a transformative role for the anti-torture movement. And I think this is the message of hope I take with us. We ultimately strive for a better world. Somewhere in one of these sessions quoted the World Happiness Index, which actually has all the happy nations on top that don't torture. So I think I wish you all a more happy world, a more successful work in the fight against torture. But it's for us to show that this issue of torture is central as a solution. Fighting it is central for the solution of many of the other causes that we've seen. That was my second point. The third one is when we speak about transformative role that we have as a movement, it's about the right to defend. It's about us as human rights defenders. I never quite understood in law school, when I had specialized classes in human rights, I learned about implementation mechanism, about law and whatever. I never learned that the key actor we need to make a difference, whatever the cause, are human rights defenders, are civil society. And I was really impressed by the sessions we had over this week on human rights defenders protection. And I just want to share 3 takeouts from that. The first one is, I was really taken aback when in the detention and defenders session, we were having the slide of the defenders that are detained across the world. And I think it calls us to action as a movement. As an anti-torture movement, we have the strength in the OMCT, both in the SOS Torture Network, on the defender side, acting on liberty, but also on the protection while being in detention. And I think this is certainly one of the areas, I think, where the OMCT within its defenders program will invest with you as a sort of SOS Defenders in Detention initiative where we want to bring in others on board as well. Second, on defenders, we have to take care of ourselves. I was very impressed by the mindfulness sessions, by the sessions on psychosocial support. I think we have to recognize that the pressures that many of you in the field feel on a permanent basis leaves traces, and we have to take care of ourselves. And I think as an anti-torture movement who knows working with victims means self-care systems, we have something to offer to the broader human rights defenders movement. And thirdly, I think over the years we have worked so much on the protection of defenders, and protection is needed. It's what our observatory work is about. It's about what the EU Human Rights Defenders mechanism is about. But I think we have to start reclaiming the place and say, this is about our right to defend. It's not only about us being protected, it's about our space to defend rights. And I think this is a framing of a debate and a legal argument that we have to put forward as we go forward. I move to another issue. Human rights defenders need strong multilateralism. We've heard this from Heidi Hautala. We've heard it from Niels. We need a special rapporteur. We need a committee against torture that is accessible and that it was effectively working despite COVID. We have to reestablish or reinforce those mechanisms that are weakened because of the COVID crisis. And I think defenders on the field, and I heard this very often, they want their voice to be heard internationally. And I think it's one of the many or the few avenues sometimes where you still can legitimize your local demand. So we should not underestimate the role that the human rights system that we've built up has, and we have to protect it. And we have to strengthen it, and we have to make sure in COVID times that the voices of the Belarusian human rights defenders that Heidi Hautala mentioned or others are still heard. Now, when we speak about multilateralism, of course, the litmus test, I think, in the fight against torture, in the end of the day, is impunity. How do we tackle impunity? I think we have thought in the human rights movement for a long time, institutional reform will do the job. And sometimes they do, and they're important. But I think prevention is important, but it doesn't work fully if there is impunity. And I think here we have to really reset an agenda. We know that with the populism that is out there, with the authoritarianism that we face, there will be more policies on impunity, more policies that produce more torture, especially on the vulnerable. So we have to build up collectively as a movement our defense lines. And I mentioned vulnerability. I think this was a big theme in this week. And it is a big theme, I think, historically for the OMCT. And if anything, we've seen in the COVID days that those are subjected to torture, police torture, outside detention very often, because I think this is also a key takeout from this. Torture happens not only in custody, it happens with the police on the streets. George Floyd was tortured to death, but it's not called torture. And this we've seen in India, we've seen in Bangladesh, we've seen it in Africa, we've seen it in Latin America, and we will see more of this type of policing. And it hits in particular the poor, marginal, and disprivileged. And we as an anti-torture movement have to address this group. We had absolutely fascinating discussions on the testimonies on the indigenous peoples panel were just breathtaking. But there are other groups, migration, it's also, torture is always me and the other. And I think there is a champ de bataille, a battlefield for us to take. I come to a closure. I think overall we have been challenged by a closing space over the years. Sometimes I feel that the vocabulary closing space acted as a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why I think we have to say right to defend rather than only protection. But I think we've also learned that we have to communicate differently. We have to be more outgoing. We have to reach the public. In German, I say, the Weimar Republic didn't go down because of the Nazis. They went down because of the lack of friends of democracy. In Henry's words, I would say, we have to regain the street. We have to win back public support to our cause. We have to be technicians where technicians are needed, but we also have to be much more outgoing, speak a different language. I found it fascinating to follow the discussions on hope-based communications and how we can be better understood. But I think we also have to bring back the centrality of the issue of torture for today. And for the OMCT and its network, and we had lots of discussion in parallel during this week with many of our network member organizations, it's time to launch a global SOS Torture Network Index that puts the issue on torture back on the agenda, gets it out of the shadows, out of the darkness, into the light. And we are looking forward to working with all of you on this. And my final word is really to you as fellow human rights defenders working on torture, often in very, very difficult circumstances. I think I really have to pay tribute to your work. I feel that this week made me confident that we are a network and a movement, and that in the end of the day, none of us can do alone what we can do together. And I think this is the most important that I take out. We are alive and kicking, we are resisting, and we will continue to resist. And I think one of the things that I think in I call it the wisdom panel to me, was mentioned is personalities matters. All of you matter. Organizations, networks have a DNA, a personality. And I think this is the biggest treasure we have. So we should all pledge to each other the solidarity to each other and the support as a network, as a movement. I started working in the former Soviet Union when I was younger. And when you live in Poland or Belarus, Russia, Lithuania, there was a saying, because the borders change all the time, I'm a person from here. It doesn't matter whether I'm from this place or that place, I'm a person from here. I felt in this week, we were all the people from here, all the people who work on torture, one family, one network, one movement. I thank you all, and I think there's an exciting agenda to build together, and I'm looking forward to working with all of you on this. Thank you.
Merci, Gerald.
Well, thank you, Gerald. So he didn't discuss with Claudia, but with all of us, because he answered to some questions that we were asking ourselves in a way. And of course, he's offered us a vision for our network in order to go on fighting against torture. I would like to thank him. And I would like to give the floor to Mrs. Zulma so that she can present us her work of art. Is she with us?
Yes, I'm here with you. Thank you all very much. I'm calling from Colombia today. Thank you to all the panelists for your wonderful words, for your amazing and inspiring work. Thank you from my heart. I'm a mother raising my children in Colombia. So it is in my heart to say, to express the gratitude for all of you who are working towards a more just and equitable world. So I would like to share with you, let me just share my screen over here. Some of the work that I started in the first panel and that I'm continuing to work. I've added a few more details. And I would now like to present it in more detail, as also as a recognition for the work, recognition to the work of Aminata, Yves, Henry, and Yahel, where I think something that really resonates with me is this sentence of looking at the past and continuing to fight impunity for a future without violations. Some of those very, very difficult stories in the detention centers that Aminata shared with us, giving a voice to people who don't have one. Recognizing that society can become an accomplice when the information is not shared, and through fear we can all just turn a blind eye and become accomplices. With all the passion of Henry, really connecting with this idea of the social movement, of people taking the streets and taking the power and taking again giving voice to those who don't have it, to turn this into a movement, and that deep sense of gratitude on behalf of India's human rights defenders. Yahel, she emphasized the importance of funds, how these funds for victims of torture and families of victims of torture can actually save lives, and how your amazing work is actually tackling the root causes of these terrible situation and situations that are still happening around the world. And I think at the center, what I'm seeing in recognition for the work of these four wonderful people and this farewell space is that sense of being a family, and that you might be saying goodbye right now, but you are part of the family, and you continue, your work continues to nurture that beautiful garden of life. So I offer my listening, I offer my visuals as a tool that might serve in the future to reconnect to the thoughts, to the concepts, to the cognitive, but also to the heart, in connecting us, in making us more human. So I hope that some of these images, when they come back to you, they will bring back some of those memories and reconnect the family and the work, and remind you that that you're not alone in this work that you're doing. So that's what I can add for now. Thank you very much. It's been wonderful. I feel blessed and honored to be part of this conversation.
Merci infiniment, cher Zulma.
Thank you very much, dear Zulma, for this work of art. This really reflects much of the debates, many of the debates. I want to thank these speakers, thank the organizers. I would like to thank my friends from the Secretariat. I want to thank Gerald. And we will see each other at 2 o'clock for the General Assembly. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.